So I'm going to begin by asking if you can recall your first encounter with David and the kind of conversations that initially took place that led to this movie being made. Did he take any convincing at all?
It's hard to remember. It happened very quickly. I was in London, actually invited to London for the purposes of trying to make an agreement with David about this set of interviews. The Sons were immensely helpful in organizing all of this. It would never have happened without them. And David and I met at his house in Hampstead, and we liked each other. I liked him, I can tell you that much. And we agreed to start this whole process. Apple wanted to pay for it, and so there we were.
I mean, of course, what we see is a 90-minute movie, but just how many and how long were the conversations you had with him? I got the impression it could have been days on end you guys chatted.
Well, it was 4 days, and probably people do get tired, particularly he's, well into his 80s. There was probably at least 4 hours a day. There's probably 12, 13, 14 hours worth of interviews there. We also filmed a lot of visual material with him as part of those days as well.
I loved the way it was all shot. Did you take any inspiration from his work and his writing to help find your own visual language in this?
Well, of course. In reading The Pigeon Tunnel, hard for me as a filmmaker to read any of Le Carré without thinking of various visuals, movie scenes, whatever. That's certainly been true for a whole number of people, because think of how many of his books have been adapted in some way or another as movies or television shows. Pigeon Tunnel is bookended by 2 parables. One, the Pigeon Tunnel itself at the very beginning, and the story of Rudolf Hess at the very end. And I love both of them. I didn't find people who necessarily agreed with me, but I thought they were both extraordinarily visual, and I wanted to turn them into film, and I did. I think they work.
No, they do. Because when he talks about his life, it feels so cinematic. When he talks about his own history, it's as though he's reading out from pages of one of his own novels. Do you think his life is especially cinematic, or do you think it's more to do with the way that he tells it?
It's hard to know, because what I know of his life is really through him. And the story of his family, the story of his mother and father, is such an extraordinary story. I mean, he's fictionalized it many times, and he's written about it many times as nonfiction. I have had this feeling really throughout this whole process, making the interviews and certainly editing all of the interviews, that you're talking about a guy struggling with his past and with history. An ongoing struggle. It's not a resolved struggle, but something that, like the search for truth, that just goes on and on and on without end. And recording part of that is fun.
Yeah, because it feels like, I love this outlook on kind of life and history. It feels like he doesn't actually seek to make sense of everything. Like he's somewhat at peace with the notion that not everything has a greater meaning to kind of people's actions. Is that something that you'd go along with, would you say?
I would say yes. We were just talking about it just in this previous interview. I hate repeating myself, but I'll repeat a few things. One of his parables is the inmost room. And that didn't come from the Pigeon Tunnel memoir. It came from a novel, a Smiley novel. And Smiley is lecturing to a group of young recruits, saying at the end of all of your work, you will come to realize there is no center to things. There is no inmost room where everything is determined, where everything is decided. The inmost room is bare. And when I first heard this story, when I first read the story in The Secret Pilgrim, I thought, oh, this is a story about how people are really, in essence, empty vessels. There may be nothing there. And David corrected me and said it was about history, that the inmost room is bare. Came in part, his love of German literature came in part from Faust. Faust's desire to know what makes the world tick, what determines everything, what, if you like, is in the inmost room. And he came to the conclusion that history was chaos. There was nothing controlling history at all. There was no inmost room. It was all just craziness, happenstance, total nonsense, total chaos.
We all expected David to speak brilliantly because we can kind of see that in his words, but did his quite striking sort of philosophical stance on kind of life and history surprise you in any way?
No, I mean, it amazed me in the sense that here I'm talking to one of the most articulate people that I've ever met. His gift with language. What I would describe as a musical ear, this incredible ear for accents, for language in general. On a dime, if you asked him to do someone's accent, whether it was Philby or Nicholas Elliott or whoever, he'd do it. And he tells us that when he was writing his novels, often he would act out the role of his characters. He would speak as they would speak. And so he was always interested just in the sound of voices. An extraordinary talent is kind of in part, I would call it a musical talent with language.
I mean, since your interview with him, I'm interested to know if you've gone back and revisited any of his work since, and has your perception or relationship of his work changed at all since these experiences one-on-one?
The answer is yes. While we were working on the editing of the film, I certainly reread The Pigeon Tunnel a number of times, but I read other novels. And sometimes the writing, just the language of his writing is quite astonishing and quite brilliant. It's a gift.
But you have a gift to interview. But one of the things I always love about your interviews is you're very non-judgmental. You really allow people just to talk, almost a fair hearing, if you will. Is that what, in part, what you think makes a good interview?
I know what makes a bad interview is that going into an interview with a predetermined set of things you want to hear, questions you're going to ask, interviews should just emerge. There should be some kind of mystery, and there should be some level of investigation where you're hearing stuff that you couldn't possibly imagine in advance. You should be surprised, endlessly surprised by what you hear. I'm often amazed at interviews where people... I had to do this film. I was asked by the Academy to do a film that was going to run at the beginning of the Oscars, I think in 2003. And they were looking for sound bites. I was looking for sound bites. What's your favorite movie? And I interviewed a lot of people. Among them, I had in the green room at one time Mikhail Gorbachev, Donald Trump, Iggy Pop, Jesse Norman, and Walter Cronkite.
It's quite a dinner party. Yeah.
Quite a dinner party, to say the very least. And I also went to the White House to interview Laura Bush. And the advanced man, who I talked to, so what's your questions going to be for Laura Bush? And I said, oh, I don't work that way. I don't have a list of questions that I'm going to ask. He says, no. You have to have a list of questions for the First Lady. I said, well, I don't do that. And so we go back and forth. He says, you have to have a list. I say, I don't do that. You have to have a list. I don't do that. So we're setting up in the White House, and the advanced man comes to me with a slip of paper with a list of the questions I'm going to ask the First Lady and what her answers are going to be. There's Q&A, Q&A, Q&A. And I look at this thing, and the first question is, what's your favorite film? And the answer is The Wizard of Oz. So we get all set up, my interviewing machine, the Interatron, blah, 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 blah. And Laura Bush comes in. She's very nice. And I say to her, is The Wizard of Oz really your favorite film? And she says, of course not. I said, well, what is your favorite film? She says, Giant. As a little girl in Midlands, Texas, she stood in line for hours hoping to be cast as an extra in Giant. And I think if you know where to look, you can study Giant. Maybe you can find Laura Bush in the extras. But people really somehow want bad interviews, or they see them very differently than I do. She was completely forthcoming, and the interview that resulted, I didn't use really much beyond just the story of her waiting in line to appear in Giant, was interesting.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm all out of time, unfortunately, but it was a pleasure to meet you today, Errol.
Oh,
Much
thank you.
appreciated.
Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching Hey You Guys!
Hey, you guys!
Hey you guys!
Hey, that's what they all say.
Hey you guys!
Hey, you guys!